Welcome to the IEF lecture series. We're so glad that you're joining with us, and we pray that you will be blessed as you receive from this teaching.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for joining in. Tonight is very much reflections from my experience. I do not claim that my experience is necessarily based on academic checking and facts and things like that, and you might easily pick holes in it, but it's the way I've experienced things throughout my life in Israel and the development of the church out here in the land, whether it's the Messianic movement or the Arab Evangelical movement as well. And over tonight and the next two talks afterwards, I'll be dealing with not just a phase in my life and experience here, but also dealing with different issues. So the one thing that kind of always, I nearly always get questions about living out here and the kind of work I've been doing is always about reconciliation. Well, I won't be dealing much with the whole topic of reconciliation this evening, but we will be dealing with it and try and just get some thoughts out of it. It's very much based on my personal experience, as I've said, reflections, and on that of my family. Now, my name is John Lionel Sode-Woodhead, and you get two pictures on the PowerPoint, and you get one with myself and three other gentlemen there. And the one out with a sea around him, his name is Lionel Gurney. And he was the founder of the Red Sea Mission Team. And I'm called John Lionel after Lionel Gurney. Now, my father wrote a book about the years he worked together with Lionel Gurney, and it's called A Grain of Mustard Seed. Can you see that? And that basically tells. Now, my father had volunteered in the Second World War, and he had become a pilot because he wanted to fight evil. He didn't come from a believing family at all, but he had a very strong notion of right and wrong, and Hitler was evil, and therefore he wanted to fight him. But when he returned back into the business world, he realized there was a lot of evil going on also within the British business world. And that got him thinking, and he went to the local church of his parish there, and he asked for a Bible, and the whatever the title of that particular church is, I never know all the titles of people, but the minister in the church basically said to him, go off, young man, and have a good life and leave religion to the older people. And so then he had to go off, and he eventually found a Bible, read through it, and came to faith. And he was baptized right up in Thurso Wick area, and then went down to the to Keswick convention, and it was at Keswick he met Lionel Gurney, and Lionel Gurney had said to him, I want you to come out with me and work amongst Muslims. And my father went away and prayed about it, and he felt very strongly that the Lord was calling him to minister amongst Jews. And Lionel Gurney told him that he was still too young in the faith and he had got it all wrong, that the Lord was clearly calling him to the Muslim world. And my father prayed, and he was more and more convinced God was calling him to the Jewish world. But eventually, he believed that the Lord was asking him to go to the Muslim world and to be there for a while. And it was from the Muslim world that he will get to Israel. And so he went off and he set up mission stations around what is Yemen today and the Dardanelles coast of Eritrea. And he was there for 5 years. Meanwhile, my mother had wanted to be a missionary as well, and from Denmark, and she was being sent off to India to teach in a school. And on her way, she was told that a Danish teacher in Aden, which is now in Yemen, it was then a British colony, had become ill and had to go back to Denmark, and could she go and stand in? And so she agreed to go and stand in and met my father, and that started a life's journey of both of them together. And on their wedding day, they received an email from the medical director of the British colony, who by then had been invited by the Church of Scotland to manage the hospital in Tiberias, Bernard Cohen Walker. He was of Jewish descent. And they basically came to Israel then a few months before I was born. And I was born in Tiberias at the Scottish Hospital at the time, which is now a luxury hotel. And we were in Tel Aviv, in Tiberias, for 5 years. And both my brothers were, my next brother, Dan, was born in Tiberias, and my youngest brother, by then the hospital had been closed, and he was born in Nazareth. But we basically spent our childhood in Israel as a family, and counted it very much as home. Since then, both my brothers left the country, and they now live in other parts of the world, or Europe, I should be more precise. And after my father died and was buried, and is buried here in Haifa, where I'm speaking to you from, my mum returned to Denmark, and where she's living now at the age of 98. And so I'm the only one of the family in Israel. And for me, it's very much home. And but I had a bit of an identity crisis over many years. I didn't know whether to count myself as Scottish or Israeli. And I was torn between the two. And it was in 2016, as my plane was landing at Edinburgh Airport, I was looking out of the window and all I could see was a runway. I said to myself, well, I'm allowed to have two identities. Why do I think I can only have one identity? I can be both Scottish and I can be Israeli. And it was as if a massive, massive load had been lifted off my shoulders, and realizing that I could have both these identities. So these two pictures in front basically show myself sitting next to my father, who's waving, and then Lionel Gurney, that I'm called after, and then us as a family. And it was the last time we were really together as a family. After that, we were a couple of times together, but it was more for weddings and things like that. But this was the very last time we were together as a family. Okay, so I'm going to be giving 3 talks. The one tonight, I'm dealing with a period from my birth in 1957 right up to 1980, but also with a little bit of a background that led up to 1957. And part of that I've already related to you, the personal side. And then the next talk, I'll be dealing with a period of 1980 to 1996. That was the period I was working as an archaeologist in the land. and at the same time building up the student movement, which is a sister organization to the UCCF, Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship. And then the third period, and the third talk, is since I returned to the land in 2016, and things that happened between 1996 and then my return in 2016 and right up to the present. And I've got a couple of subjects that I want to get into greater depth over, and one of them being that of reconciliation as well. These are just, again, I don't have any terribly exciting pictures, except that was my 5th birthday in kindergarten in that photograph. And then myself and my 2 brothers when we'd already moved to Nazareth. Now, before I continue to go into the issues that I kind of raised with, I want to deal a little bit with the question of language or names. And I think if we look at this and you see the complexity of how you use words and names out here and the significance of them, then you begin to understand that nothing out here is straightforward. If you can make it complicated, then you realize that everything is even 3 times as complicated as you can possibly make it. And nothing is straightforward and simple. So if we take the word we'll start with the English. We talk about ourselves as being Christians. If we want to define what kind of Christians we are, we're evangelicals. If we're out here and we're English speakers, we'd say Messianics. Christ is the Greek word, Messiah is the Hebrew word, but referring to the same person. But then let's go back to the Hebrew and to the Arabic. In Hebrew, Messianic is Meshichi. Yes, the Mashiach is the Messiah. And Yeshua HaMashiach, or Yeshua the Messiah. But that's not the name of which Christians are known in the land. Christians are known as Notzriim. Now, there are different understandings of where the word Notzri comes from. One of them is because Nazareth is from the same root name. So it will be the Nazarites, people from Nazareth. Or else, the other thing is, in Isaiah, we read about the offshoot of David, or Netzer David. Yes, an offshoot. That is what Netzer is. So are we talking here about people from Nazareth, or are we talking about the offshoot of David? In one sense, it doesn't really matter, because in my view, the reason they looked for a name other than that of Meshichi is that both the early Jews and the early Gentile believers, as they were separating one from the other, particularly after the destruction of the temple, were not wanting to show association one with the other. So the Jews did not want to acknowledge Yeshua or Jesus as the Messiah, so they were looking for another word, most likely the Nazarites. Yes, the people who followed that man from Nazareth. And for the Gentiles, they just switched to Greek and used Christ instead of Mashiach, okay? So that explains that. Now in Arabic, it's a little simpler, because Arabic doesn't have all these complications with identity and their relationships with that man, yes, as it would be from the Jewish side. So Arabs are known as Messihiyin, those who follow the Messiah, in a Semitic word, an Arabic word in this case. Al-Masih, they follow the Messiah. But all Christians are Messihiyin. So there is no difference between whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, Coptic, Lutheran, Baptist, or whatever it is. You are a Gentile if you are a believer in Jesus, then you're a Messihi. So that looks pretty straightforward. Now, up to now, that makes life fairly simple. But now the complications start. And the complications have got a lot to do with identity and also with, mainly with identity for today. So, for example, when the Messianic movement, they're in a predominantly Jewish land. 70% of the population are Jewish. Hebrew is a national language. You would expect things to be in Hebrew. You would expect things to be Hebraicized. So you would expect them to use the Hebrew word Meshichi rather than a Greek word Christ. But the way things are used today is that they've resisted using the word Meshichi in the population as a whole, and they continue to use the word Notzri. The Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Tourism has got into a little trouble over this worldwide, because the name for Yeshua in Hebrew, which comes, it's an abbreviation from the Hebrew, which basically stands for "May his name be erased and forgotten forever." And when I did my tour guides course, we were told as one of the first things that we were to call him Yeshua, not Yeshu. And particularly the religious Jews in the class got upset, and they said, why? And the course coordinator, she's now the director for training for the Ministry of Tourism in the country as a whole. She said, number one, every evangelical knows what you mean when you say Yeshu. And in today's politically correct modern world, it is unacceptable to call the leader of another religion by a curse word. And so the Ministry of Interior has decided that his name should be Yeshua. The second thing is he was Jewish, his name was Yeshua, and full stop, she said. Now, the class found it difficult to take that in, and many did, and they accepted it, but many still found it difficult. And what I've noticed is that in the class, they would use the word Yeshua, but now 2 years since we've finished our course, when I hear some of the others, they go back and they say Yeshu rather than Yeshua. So I guess it'll take a couple of generations before that comes out. When it comes to the Messianic movement, they were wanting to put the emphasis that they were not foreigners who were coming in with some kind of non-Jewish religion, but wanted to put the emphasis on the Jewishness, that they belong to the Jewish people. And therefore, by using the word Meshichi, they were putting that emphasis on the Hebrew, Israeli, Jewish nature of their identity and where they belong to. Some take it a bit far in that they speak out against Messianic Jews have any contact at all with believing Christians from other countries. But on the whole, Messianic Jews realize that their faith largely overlaps that of evangelical Christians. So the word Meshichi has been generally accepted, but Meshichi was always accepted as referring to Jews. But a lot of people are not strictly Jews. There are many who are married to somebody who is Jewish, and particularly if it's the father who's Jewish and the mother who's not Jewish, strictly speaking, the children are not Jewish. Even if they were born in Israel, brought up in education in the Jewish schools and everything, they're not, by Orthodox law, they're not Jewish. So how do you include them as well? So in recent years, you've started to hear a suffix added onto Meshichi. So somebody who is Jewish would be a Meshichi Yehudi. That means he's proper Jewish. If you just say a Meshichi and leave it as that, everybody reads between the lines and realizes, like me, that I'm part of the Messianic movement, but I'm not Jewish. And if it's an Arab who's part of the Messianic congregations, of which there are more and more, then it's Meshichi Aravi. Yes, an Arab Messianic. So that's where complications come in from the Hebrew side. On the Arabic side, you might say, well, there are no problems there between Messihi and Meshichi. Well, you'll be wrong. There are problems there. Not so much from the Meshichim, the Jewish believers, because to them they just hear Messihi, and it's the same word that they use for Meshichi. But you see, the Arab believers, what they do is they look at the Messianic Jews and say, well, the Messianic Jews are all Christian Zionists, and they're all anti-Arabs, and they all want the greater Israel. And therefore, we cannot identify with them. We can identify with them as brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus, but we can't identify with them politically. The fact that it's not as black and white as that, and there are all the shades of the political spectrum, both on the Jewish side and on the Arab side, as there is in society as a whole, is usually forgotten. And but they don't want their word Messihi to be identified with the Hebrew word Meshichi. So they feel very, very uncomfortable with that, and they don't like to be referred to as Meshichim at all. So I've just taken the word, one word, to describe the community. And you realize immediately that it's incredibly complex. And there is a lot to do with identity. There's a lot to do with a modern conflict. Even if we have the same faith and we still, through it all, count ourselves as brothers and sisters in Christ, even with all that, there are deep disagreements and a great deal of unease on an identity level. Yes, and we'll be talking more about that in the future. So the picture and the one that you'd seen before was when I was in my late teens, just before I left the country for Edinburgh to study. I used to, both on the Arab side and on the Messianic side, I used to go to camps and be one of the leaders in the camps and look after a group of the younger kids and so on. And the picture before was specifically at an Arab run camp, and we received the badge of honor of having been the best group throughout that camp week, which was nice to have. And in this, and the picture here in this one is the chapel in the hospital in Nazareth. Now, the chapel was, it's a simple chapel. You'll see that you can't just see from the angle at which the picture is taken on, but on the left, up on what appears to be the wall, is actually a cross with windows around it. So the cross stands out. And the pillars you see holding, like on the right-hand side, is also in the shape of a cross made from iron. And then the pulpit is a carpenter's table, and the lectern is a carpenter's toolbox. And I spent a lot of my childhood going to the chapel in the hospital in Nazareth, and it used to be a place where the various churches, particularly in those days, there was less of a relationship. Today, relationships are better, but then there was less of a relationship between the Baptist and the Brethren, for example, but they would be quite happy to come up to the hospital. And the chapel was dedicated on my 8th birthday. So I've got a kind of, my father that was his first project in seeing being built, was a chapel, but then also its dedication on my birthday. Well, for the rest of the time that we have together, I want to cover a number of issues. First of all, I don't want to get into great detail because about the pre-1948, the beginnings of the modern, let's say, evangelical, Messianic, etc., work in Israel, that's a whole study in itself, and one I know in general, but I don't know I haven't followed up in great detail. But the very earliest work was done by CMJ, Church Mission to the Jews, that started in about 1810 in Britain. And then the first work out here was in the 1840s. And it was in 1841 or somewhere around there that the first bishop was appointed, and he was a Jew, Rabbi Solomon Alexander. And at that time, the Anglican Church had an agreement with the Lutheran Church, and that's when Christ's Church was built. And the agreement was that they would switch backwards and forwards between having an Anglican bishop to a Lutheran bishop back to an Anglican bishop. And when Solomon Alexander died, the Anglicans basically refused to let a Lutheran become the bishop. And so no Lutheran was made bishop. And instead of that, a Swiss German Gobat was appointed as like to the rank of bishop, even though he was Reformed theology rather than Lutheran, if I understand correctly. All that basically meant that the arrangement between the Lutherans and the Anglicans broke down. Meanwhile, the Anglicans had set up a hospital. They had set up various types of schools and schools and work in terms of helping Jews in difficulty. Now, from the Jewish side, they knew exactly what CMJ was up to, and it resulted in two things. First of all, is that they encouraged Jews not to go to CMJ facilities. That didn't stop people going, but they encouraged them not to go because their souls would be stolen by those Christians. And the second thing is it got the Jewish community thinking, well, if they're not to go to these Christian places, we have to build up our own institutions. And you'll find out that many of the institutions, earliest institutions in Jerusalem, medical and education ones, started in the mid-19th century as a reaction to that, to provide a Jewish alternative. Now, the Lutherans at that point decided that they were going to develop their own work, and they built the Redeemer Church, which is down next to the Holy Sepulchre. And Kaiser Wilhelm II came out in the 1890s, I think it was 1898, to Jerusalem for the dedication of the church. Now, I'm focusing on these two because for a very long time, they were the real, the only real, let's say, I would say they were pretty much evangelical in their faith in those days, rather than the more liberal-minded that we see today. But they were not the only ones around. The Church of Scotland by then had already started to work in the land, and the Southern Baptists from the United States were working, and in 1911, the First Baptist Church was set up, and also the Brethren had been active for quite a while. Now, all this happened during the Ottoman or Turkish period, which ended with World War I. And then the British took over with a British mandate, and it continued until 1948. And of course, being a Western democracy with freedom of religion and all the other civil rights benefits that there were in Britain at the time and within the empire, there was both safety and security for people of various faiths and to develop. And the Arab church developed at the time. And also on the Messianic side, you saw more Messianic congregations. And probably the one that is considered today, not one set up by a foreign missionary organization, but an indigenous local one, the oldest one, is just about 100 years old, and it was established here in Haifa, called Bet Hesda. And that would be the oldest of the, let's say, indigenous Messianic congregations in the land. So the time of the British Mandate was a time of flourishing and development. But then World War II came, and the Holocaust, and the Christian world was thrown into total turmoil about the Christian associations and the Holocaust. So, for example, Judaism is both a religion and it is a people with an ethnic identity. So in the Jewish mind, it's hard for them to separate out the ethnic identity from the religion. So every European, and you don't have to be religious to be Jewish. You can be an atheist and still be Jewish, yes? Many find it difficult to separate out the way we do people of faith and people who don't have faith. And the matter of choice and what you choose in terms of your faith has probably little to do with your ethnic or national background. And therefore, in the minds of many, it's probably less today than what it used to be. Hitler was a Christian. And see what Christian Hitler did to the Jewish people. See what Christianity did, yes? Now, then they get a little bit confused when they see all the righteous Gentiles who were Christians who helped Jews and saved them, and so on. But this still lingers in terms of the identity. And that was very, very strong immediately after the Second World War, once the horrors of the Holocaust were fully understood. And by that stage, the tension between the Arabs and the Jews in the land had reached such proportions that there was no obvious solution in the way of going ahead. And Britain was exhausted following World War II, and holding 100,000 soldiers in Palestine at the time was just more than it could cope with, and decided to return the mandate for Palestine to the United Nations. But before they did that, both Britain and then the United Nations, they looked at all the options, and the only option they came up with, which would be fair and viable to both sides, taking the aspirations of both sides, but not ones that were acceptable to either side, was to split the country into two. And you had a Jewish state, the state of Israel, and you'd have a Palestinian state running alongside it. And they proposed a split. Now, I always get asked the question, was it my uncle or my grandfather or somebody who set the borders of what this split would be between the two? Because the guy who headed the technical commission that established the proposed borders, his name was Sir John Woodhead. And so people often associate me with the Sir John Woodhead. Now, as far as I know from my father, there is absolutely no family connection between us. But I do get asked the question not infrequently. This was the situation in 1948. It was decided to go ahead with the establishment of the State of Israel. But then the question that arose amongst the believing evangelical community in the land was, how do we relate to this modern new Jewish state? And there were many who felt that Christians had no right to continue to be in Palestine then, and what would become the Jewish state after what had happened in Christian countries in Europe under the Nazis. They had no right, and therefore the Jews should be left on their own, and people should pull out of the land completely, anybody who wasn't Jewish, and they should be left on their own. A minority disagreed with this and felt that it was precisely now, or at that time, under the crisis that existed, that it was important for particularly evangelical Christians to continue working within the new Jewish state. And a conference was held in Edinburgh, I'm told. I've tried to look up literature about it, but I can't find anywhere, I've not found anywhere written about it, but it was about 1947, 48, 49, 50, somewhere around about then, that apparently a conference was held, because I've met people who were at it. And the missions that were active in the land during the period of the mandate met in order to talk about the future and what their role should be. And the majority felt that they should pull out, and even most of the Messianic Jews who living in the land, they helped them to leave the country. And it was the end of the pre-state Messianic movements, and all the prosperity and development and richness and so on, relatively speaking, that had existed during the mandate period kind of disappeared. But there was a minority of organizations, as I referred to, said, no, now we have to stay. And amongst them was CMJ. Church of Scotland had its hospital in Tiberias, and therefore it was a medical work, essentially, and the church in Jerusalem. And there was a greatly loved minister at Church of Scotland, Bill Gardner Scott. He was out here for decades and decades, and he just never shied away from sharing the gospel with anybody, even through these dark days. And I knew him when he was in his 90s. And I was working in Jerusalem, and always had a great deal of encouragement from him. And he was very close friends with one of the most famous mayors of Jerusalem that Jerusalem's ever had, Teddy Kollek. And Teddy Kollek made sure that one of the streets in Jerusalem would be called the Bill Gardner Scott Street after him. Now, Bill was the only evangelical Christian who was ever allowed to have services broadcast from Israel radio. Yes. And these are people who chose to make a stand and say, no, we are not leaving. We are staying with the Jewish people. And they were just a handful, a minority. But wherever you speak to people, they were highly respected. You had the hospital in Nazareth, you had the Southern Baptist work, you had a few missions that stayed on. Now, one mission actually came into the land at the time and started, and that was the Norwegian church ministry to Israel. And they had had a big work going on in Bucharest in Romania. And one of the churches there, where this particular missionary, he was co-pastor together with Wurmbrand. And most of the congregation were Jewish believers. And in the early 1960s, when Wurmbrand was in prison and so on for his faith under the communist regime was the only one of the communist countries that allowed Jews to emigrate to Israel. And they came to Israel, and the organization I was working with until the end of June last year was the Norwegian Church Ministry to Israel. And a lot of the works and ministries in Israel, they had a hand in establishing Ebenezer, Home for the Elderly, Bet Eliyahu Congregation, Emmanuel Congregation, Kaspari Center. They had very strong influence in the founding and establishment of the Bible Society in Israel. And that all came in when this co-minister with Wurmbrand followed the Jewish immigrants and came to the land and started up the Norwegian work. Now, so you had on the Arab side a very traumatized community. They had basically lost everything they had been fighting for. They had wanted a land, and a land that would more fairly reflect their numbers. And not only did those who remained within the state of Israel find themselves as a minority and an occupied minority, military law was lifted from them only at the end of the 60s, but even in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, they were under the occupation of the Jordanians and Egyptians, and they had no independence. And so basically they had lost everything, and they were highly traumatized, and most of the members had fled the country or had been pushed out, depending on perspectives and circumstances and where things were at. And then you had the Messianic movement. And on the Messianic movement, there was only a handful of people left, very, very few people. And nearly everybody, and this was my early childhood, I went to the Baptist church in Nazareth, both very highly traumatized. Looking back on it now, I didn't realize it at the time. But then also the Messianic movement where I was involved. So I was fully involved both with the Arab youth and with the Messianic youth. And there, the one thing they would tell you is don't let anybody know that we believe in Yeshua. We don't want people to know. And when I used to go to the youth conferences, we used to have them in a congregation once every 6 weeks for Friday afternoon till Saturday evening. And there were about 25 of us between the ages of 13 and 30. And that's what's existed in the land. There was no other youth between those ages, except for about the 25 of us between these age groups. I, of course, started off as the youngest at the age of 13. And it was this just tiny little group, scared, afraid, not wanting anybody to know what their faith was. And personally, these kind of things never bothered me. And I would quite happily let people know what my faith was, but then I wasn't Jewish, and that was okay. And I used to be very provocative in the classroom. They used to ask parents' names at the beginning of the year, and I'll give parents' names, and then occupation. And people would say occupation, and I could have got away by saying engineer or something like that about my father. And just to see the reaction in the class, I would say missionary. Now, missionary is about the dirtiest word you could possibly say and describe anybody in the country. And I used to enjoy looking at the reactions of everybody around me. And so on. So anyway, this was the beginnings. But amongst all this fear, there were two men. And they didn't get on well together at all. But they both fought for the building up of a Messianic movement in Israel. One, his name was Victor Smudger. He had come from Tunisia. And the other one was Baruch Moz. I'm not too sure where he came from, probably North America somewhere. And they fought. And today, the movements that they set up within the Messianic movement are some of the most influential in the country and in the land. Now, there are other things associated with that, but they really come into the next period, which I will share next time. But the thing is that throughout this period, it was the expatriate organizations that were still the dominant organizations. So you had, let's say, 80% of believers in the country, whether Jewish or Arab, all within the safe confines of these expatriate missionary organizations. And only a minority will be out on their own, setting up their own thing, whether it was Arab or Brethren mainly. The reason I don't bring the Anglican in is because very quickly after the establishment of the State of Israel, there was a drift in the Anglican community away from, let's say, evangelicalism, as many of us would hold it, with a stronger and stronger draw towards the traditional churches. So that basically left the Brethren and the Baptists as the dominant movements. Then there is another peculiarity of the system out here, which basically follows that instituted by the Turkish Empire and then continued by all colonial empires in the Middle East. They couldn't find a better system to replace it. And all nations in the Middle East have followed it. And it was called the millet system. And basically, you were a citizen of the empire, of the Turkish Empire, and then other countries, and there are civil responsibilities and rights that you have as a citizen of a country. But then you're also registered as a member of a smaller ethnic religious minority group. And each group would be recognized by law, and all personal affairs and things allocated to them by Parliament would be regulated by law according to the beliefs of that own community. So this is considered into Israel today, and it's entrenched in law in Israel. You'll be either registered as Jewish or Muslim, Sunni, or one of a number of Christian denominations like Greek Orthodox, Catholic, Greek Catholic, and the Anglicans. Which means then that personal issues like births, marriages, divorce, inheritance goes by the laws of the community you belong to. So if you want to get divorced in Israel, if you're Jewish, only the husband can divorce the wife. The wife can't divorce the husband. If you're registered as a Catholic, neither the husband or the wife can divorce the other. There is no divorce amongst Catholics in Israel. If you're Muslim, any side can divorce the other. There's no problem about that at all. Now, what happens with Baptists and so on? Well, they're not a recognized community. So they are all technically under the Anglican community. So it means that if anybody wants to get married or divorced within, let's say, Pentecostal, Baptist, Brethren, or whatever, they have to go to the courts of the Anglican Church. Now, the laws established that bring in the codes for the Anglican Church would have been approved by the Judiciary Committee and then by the full Parliament, the Knesset in Israel. So it's all regulated and established by law, but it still reflects the local community. So you can see immediately that there are complications between the different communities. Well, in 1957, when I was born, the expatriate organizations, the Messianic Jews and the Evangelical Arabs, they were wanting to set themselves up as a community and a recognized community, separate from that of the Anglicans. And it was rejected. But the UCCI at that point was established, the United Christian Council in Israel. But over the years, the Messianics refused to have anything to do with it, and basically went back to the 50s and said it's an expatriate organization. The Arabs were not too worried about it being an expatriate organization, but thought it was too pro-Jewish to be of help to the Arabs and didn't reflect an Arab identity. So they have refused to have anything to do with it. So in a sense, today you've got three, let's say, groups with an evangelical theology to it, which is the United Christian Council in Israel, or it's called now the Evangelical Alliance in Israel, which is 95% expatriate organizations. Then you've got the Council of Evangelical Arab Churches, and then you've got the meeting of elders of the Messianic congregations in Israel. So you've got three organizations which have virtually nothing to do with each other, and they have very little communication with each other. Now, the Arab side, and with this I'll finish, the Arab side decided that they wanted to push to be recognized as a community in Israel. So they pushed hard at it. They got the 5 different evangelical Arab churches together, the Baptists, the Open Brethren, the Nazarenes, Church of Christ, and the Apostolic Pentecostals together. And the president of Israel, the prime minister, everybody were very much in favor of granting it to them, and it looked as if it was home and dry, until the lawyers got involved. And the lawyers said, yes, but if you look at the regulations, every community has to have a religious leader. And the laws that are passed that regulate the community and then approved by Parliament, they are the ones that trump over any internal laws or anything that goes. So basically, when you come to the evangelicals, for example, the Brethren, they don't have any ordained pastors or leadership as such at all, yes? So that would immediately go against their views about having like a patriarch or a chief rabbi who was in charge of the group. That wouldn't work out. And then it would mean that any rules established, which would be very typically Baptist or apostolic or whatever, would be more important than those of their own denominations, which basically would mean you'd be creating a new denomination. So none of them liked that either. So the whole idea fell through, and they are still in association with 5 churches. But what happens when it comes to marriage? And this created a great deal of embarrassment. A couple went, after 20 years of marriage, they went to get divorced, an Arab couple. They were members of the Baptist church. And they were told, why do you want to get divorced? You're not even married. And they said, yes, we are married. Here's our marriage certificate. And the judges and lawyers, they looked at it and they said, this is a non-authorized marriage certificate. And what had happened is that the minister at the time had just printed off marriage certificates with no authorization from the Anglican Church, and had married them and given them the marriage certificates, but they were not legally recognized by the state. And so it was a real embarrassment to an evangelical couple in a society which questions divorce, and then to find out that they've been living together and had 3 children and they were not even married legally. And so this is where things stand at the moment, and all the confusion that it creates. I think with starting off with confusion, and I'll finish off with confusion, but hopefully we can put some more order into things from the next talk onwards. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions. Remember, you need to unmute.
Yeah, John.
Hi, Neil.
Hi there. Great to hear your story again. And I'm interested to know what the state of play is with sharing faith publicly and privately, or in the workplace, for example, in Israel at the moment.
Yes, you're raising a question which has more to do with perceptions of non-Israelis rather than the reality on the ground in Israel. In Israel, there is complete freedom of faith and freedom of expressing one's faith. Yes, there is no limitation on that. Anybody can believe whatever they want, and just like in Britain, and you have the right to do so. And if anybody tries to stop you, you've got the right to challenge it. Having said that, what the government does, because, well, no, I'll finish this part first. What the government does in order to stop foreign missionary organizations from coming into the land, any foreign organization that wants to establish it into the land has to sign a document with the Ministry of Interior promising that they will not share their faith. Now, this is not an Israeli law. but the Ministry of Interior has the discretion to deny people the right to operate in Israel. And unless they are willing to sign this document, they don't get that permission. So it's a matter of choice that people have on that basis. Yeah, and that's the only kind of restriction that the authorities can put on in terms of faith. Now, all this started, well, there's been many cases. It keeps on coming periodically before the Knesset or Parliament about forbidding conversion or the sharing of the Christian faith. Now, one thing I found interesting in my course, tour guides course, is that there is no problem for Orthodox Jews, for example, to enter a mosque or to go to a shrine, a Buddhist shrine or anything. There's no problem with that at all. But they are absolutely forbidden to enter a church. And when we did the course, all the religious would be standing outside. When we went to a mosque, they all came inside. And so that's how strong the feelings are, specifically this relationship between Christians and Jews. And so in 1977, a law was passed, basically saying that it is illegal to convince somebody to convert to another religion, a minor that is, anybody to another religion or for monetary gain. Okay? So sometimes what they try and do, and they say, oh, he promised me money if I would convert to Christianity. Yes, and I converted because of the money that he offered me. That will be considered illegal in Israel. But that's the only thing in law that, and a minor has to follow that of his parents up until the age of 18. And after that, the choice is their own. But again, so long as there's no monetary gain.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
John, you painted a picture of some considerable confusion as the outsider would look at the church scene in Israel. I wanted to ask, for a Jew who has no particular interest in Christianity, is all that complexity and the different denominations and their different perspectives and different approaches, is that a problem for the average Jew, or is it just something that is going on in the background without relevance?
All's correct. Most of the time goes back in the background with no relevance at all. For some, it's a big issue. So, for example, I read the biography of Rabbi Lau, who was a former chief rabbi in Israel. And he talks about he went specifically to the Vatican, and he made it as one of the top points in his mission as chief rabbi to stop Christians converting Jews to the Christian religion. Yes. And so for some people, this is very important. For most people, if they do think of Christianity, they equate Christianity virtually entirely with the Catholic Church. They don't even see the difference unless it's pointed out with the Greek Orthodox Church. Whereas if you just open your eyes, you see that churches are very different. But Christianity is what the Catholics say. And then if you start pushing them a little bit and saying, then they say, never knew this, never thought about it. And then the more they try and find out, they just find it confusing. So on the tour guides course, for example, it was fascinating being involved in that, because these were people who wanted to understand the differences. And you could get real engagement with these people. But most Israelis just prefer just to not be interested in the slightest, and just find it too difficult and too complicated, and think that if Christians can make life hard, then they make it life as hard as they can for themselves, and that's the way they leave it.
Well, they might be right.
John, when you say that the Israelis or Jewish folk tend to think of the Roman Catholic Church as Christianity, is that because the Roman Catholic Church is the most visible in Israel compared with the Greek Orthodox Church?
No, not necessarily. The Greek Orthodox Church is very visible. In terms of when you say visible, I'm thinking more about the buildings and institutions and the priests and things going around. I don't really know, John, what the difference is. The only things that come immediately to mind is that the Catholic Church is more Western, and in the West it had a dominant role to play. And all the Ashkenazi Jews, those from the West, would have come with the dominance of the Catholic world around them from Europe, whereas the Orthodox Church was mainly in the Arab lands. And in the Arab lands, as Christians, they were very much a minority, and also had to keep very discreet from the majority Muslim population, and probably they had less to do with it. Also, the Catholic Church is more organized, is more structured and organized in its ways, and it knows how to promote itself much more clearly. Those would be my immediate thoughts. I really don't know beyond that.
Super. That's yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
It's a very exciting time to be part of the. I basically live within the Messianic movement, yes, and most of my work is there. I have a lot to do with my Arab evangelical friends as well, but I'm not, just because of where I am, the circumstances I'm in, I'm not as involved on the Arab side as I am on the Jewish side. And it's very exciting times to be out here. And, you know, I might raise all these complexities, but a lot of these things happen behind the scenes amongst the leaders for most people around in their daily lives. And as a community, all they're seeing is the vibrance of a community that's developing and growing. There's somewhere between 20 and 30,000. There's a bit of an argument as to how big the community is. But you do see now and again, and more often than not, in translation on the TV and that, instead of writing Yeshu, they would write Yeshua, for example. And that's becoming more frequent. And Messianic Judaism is kind of today more viewed, okay, yes, they are Jewish, but we'll consider them as Christians would view more the Mormons, let's say, out there on a limb, yes. We prefer not to call them Jewish, but we have no choice. Because they are Jewish, we'll call them Jewish. So there's a greater acceptance from what they used to be. And also a lot of the young Israelis in the military service, and when they do it, they volunteer for the elite units. Now, as Israel's becoming a wealthier and wealthier country, I'm sorry if it offends somebody, but all the talk is only about mothers and how they don't like their children being in danger, and how members of Knesset are being pestered by mothers left, right, and center who want them to operate on their behalf to make sure their kids don't go into any dangerous units at all. Whereas the Messianic Jews, they're from the first who go and volunteer for all these elite units. and go into them. So the army actually likes them very much. They find them very, very dedicated and committed.
I did want to ask, the early pictures you showed of yourself with your brothers, I didn't know you in those days. I didn't know which person in the picture was you each time.
Oh, I was a sensible, serious-looking one. No, I'm the oldest of the three brothers.
Right. Yes.
So
I was guessing which was the oldest, but yeah, it's difficult to tell.
It's a pleasure to see you again today. I just want to find out whether you know the Ethiopian Jews.
yes.
Whether in Israel, whether they have their own church or whatever you call it, or they are mixed with the Israeli from other parts of the world that are there.
Well, the one who can speak a whole lot better on the Ethiopian Jewish community than I can is Gwen, as she's married to one. But I can just tell you a little bit about in a few words about the community out here in Israel. There's a big struggle going on at the moment within the community at large. When they came, many of them suddenly landed from the Middle Ages into the 21st century, and many of them didn't know how to handle it. And they were just told, you have to be Orthodox Jewish. But now many of them are insisting on going back to having the structures and the leaders that they had in Ethiopia. And that's causing quite a bit of tension. When you're talking about the believing community, well, there you've got many Ethiopian congregations, but there are many Ethiopians, particularly the next generation, who prefer to be involved and integrated into the Messianic Hebrew-speaking congregations, because that's what they were taught at school. That's what the language they live and work, whether it's in the army or now at university or in their professions. And that's what they feel most comfortable with. So within the Ethiopian community, to me, it's amazing to see this community within the land. And I can tell you some stories about some of those that I know. Some of the most exciting people, I think, for the future come from the Ethiopian community. And yet they have struggles, and they probably will have struggles before they can really express themselves.
Thank you very much for your talk, John. That's very insightful. Let's finish our time together with prayer. Loving Heavenly Father, we want to come before you again and just give you great thanks for your goodness and your love towards us. Thank you again for your faithfulness, and that you have given us that task of reaching out to your world in love with the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for all that John has shared this evening, and we just pray that you would help us to remember many of the things that he has shared with us, and that we may have opportunity to be a witness for you to people who have come from Israel to visit Scotland or other countries around the world. Help us to be able to connect with them in some way or other and share the good news of Jesus. And so, Lord, we just again commit John to you, asking that you would continue to give him a recovery from this ill health and operation, and that you would give him strength and stamina for the weeks and months ahead. Thank you for all that he does, and we just pray for your continued help for him. May he be able to see you uplifted and glorified in his life. So, Lord, we commit ourselves to you. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for joining with us for this lecture. For more information about future lectures, please visit our website www.iefinternational.com or contact us directly via our email address info at iefinternational.com. We hope that you have been blessed by what has been shared, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.